Hello, I'm Yonit Levy from Tel Aviv.
And I'm Jonathan Friedland in London.
And we are Unholy from Keshet Podcasts.
Unholy, talking Jews, talking news. That is what we're doing. And Yonit, you are the anchor of Channel 12 News in Israel.
And you, Jonathan, are a columnist for The Guardian.
That's right. We're reminding people always what we do, but right here we talk Jews and we talk news. And Yonit, huge amounts of news in your part of the world.
Oh, wow. Right. We are recording this directly after the lists for Israeli elections have been finalized, meaning we have 6.5 weeks before the elections. And it means no more mergers are possible. There are still dropouts that are an option. Maybe I'm foreshadowing what we might talk about. But yes, an immense amount of political news coming out of Israel this week.
So it means we're sort of breaking convention because this is already really the weekend for you. And yet here you are, you're talking to me on a Friday morning. I mean, what would you normally be doing early on a Friday like this?
Reading like 5 Israeli newspapers. Trying to read them as quickly as possible before anyone wakes up. That is yes. But instead, I'm talking to you, which is, I think, more fun.
It is. I mean, this is normally a very big working day for me because I write a weekend column for the paper in London, and Friday is normally a really big and intense working day. So we've added to the stress here by starting early, but no shortage of what's going on. And so midnight was the sort of witching hour for Israel and for this upcoming election.
Exactly. I think the whole story of the finalizing of the list, which is like an important threshold on the way to Election Day, is more about what didn't happen than did, right? I mean, the Gideon Sa'ar and Naftali Bennett option of a merger didn't happen. Gantz didn't drop out. We can talk about that, of course. And Labor and Meretz didn't merge, and neither did Labor run with anyone else. All of this, just to sort of put a bottom line on it, pretty good news for Netanyahu. It means that the right, we should get used to calling it not the right and the left, but the anti-Bibi camp and the pro-Bibi camp. So the pro-Bibi camp is pretty much unified, and the anti-Bibi camp is pretty much fractured. So that is the news coming out. We can roll the dice and pick on whoever. I actually said pick on. I meant pick whoever we want to start with first to discuss, to kind of go into the granular detail of what we want to talk about.
No, I definitely want to go granular, obsessively so. Very looking forward to that. But just on this big picture
obsessive
point. I think superly nerdy on this sort of subject. We're both going to dive in deep, but I just think the big picture point that you mentioned has to be right. That he gets to look like the kind of giant, and there's the 7 dwarves trailing after him. But it was from the outside, it was kind of like that anyway. There is just this sense with every Israeli election, and I see it even among sort of journalists, a sense of, I'm going to switch off, wake me up when it's over, because there is this fatalistic assumption that, whatever machinations there are, who's up, who's down, new parties, mergers, splits, in the end, it'll be Netanyahu who merges as the prime minister. That's just now a kind of law of nature about Israeli politics. And even when the election's over and it looks like he's lost, still somehow 3 months later, he's still there as prime minister. So that's why you find it's a really sort of shrinking market of super nerds who are really interested in the fine-grained detail. But no, I think it matters. The other slight sort of non-fatalistic thought is, look, they've tried the other way of having a single challenger, Benny Gantz or, Bougie Herzog or whoever, and that didn't work either to prize him out. So maybe in some as yet undefined way, having lots of, split, fragmented opposition, who knows, maybe that can work better because it certainly didn't work the other time.
Well, I think what's interesting this time around, right, is that you really don't have, as you say, you don't have that main Netanyahu challenger emerging. I had an American friend call me up the other day and he said, I understand there are many parties in Israel, but who's running against Bibi? Is it Bibi versus who? And I said, it's Bibi versus COVID, to be honest, right? I mean, we are in the midst of a pandemic in Israel. The numbers are dire, right? We just hit the 5,000 dead mark, which is terrible. And at the end of the day, if we are we are 6 weeks into lockdown, we are with the same numbers that we had 6 weeks ago. The numbers aren't going down of the infection rate. If we are in the same situation mid-March, Netanyahu is in has a big problem. he imagined this sort of campaign being him walking, the vaccination rollout being perfect, the numbers going down, him walking between cafes in Tel Aviv while Europe and the U.S. are still closed. And suddenly it looks like, if we'll be able to take away from cafes and sit somewhere on a sidewalk, that would be a big deal. So I think that is the one thing that kind of needs to be in your heads. To anyone trying to follow the really baffling corridors of Israeli politics, that should be the one thing that can make a difference this time, for sure.
But within that, I mean, I'm like with your friends probably in the United States saying, because they're used to a presidential system, so who's the guy who's taking him on? And we should say it is almost always guys. The Israeli political landscape incredibly, intensely testosterone, to quote Friends from the 1990s. I mean, it is very, very male. But I mean, I suppose, you tell me if I'm wrong, that the one person the anti-Bibi camp is crystallizing around, the man we've talked about on the podcast before, former TV host, like you, former columnist, like me, Yair Lapid.
And author of thrillers like you, Jonathan, we should mention as well, although under his own name. But yes, that is so. As you say, it is sort of crystallizing around Yair Lapid. I think Lapid is kind of utilizing a convergence of resentments, right? He's the anti-Bibi camp. Remember that Lapid is, first of all, officially the head of opposition, and of course he broke with his own party, the Blue and White Party, when Benny Gantz decided to go into Netanyahu's coalition, and he was left out. He decided not to opt for that. And, he was basically a rarity even in the Israeli left because parts of the Labor Party did enter the coalition. So he's sitting on that resentment and also the resentment of course, the anti-Orthodox sentiment that is very strong in Israel. We talked about that. He toned that down, that rhetoric. But he's still sort of seen as that symbol of secular Israel. He doesn't have to say anything against the ultra-Orthodox, and he doesn't want to say anything against them, but he's definitely sitting on that sentiment. So he can grow stronger. We kind of see that in the polls. Again, we have 6.5 weeks. That's eternity in Israeli politics. But when you talk about Yair Lapid, I think thus far he has been sort of dismissed, right? Okay, he was a huge television star. He was even Netanyahu's finance minister for about 2 odd years, but he wasn't ever considered as a serious contender. It was sort of, he doesn't have enough gravitas. And remember, he had to bring on 3 IDF chiefs of staff with him in the Blue and White Party to be considered serious. And I think it goes to this sort of undercurrent in Israeli society, right? That when Americans kind of want to know what status you're in, they ask you, they want to see if you're Ivy League. They want to see where you went to school, where you went to college. In Israel, it's always, where did you do your military service, right? If you're a country under existential threat or you feel like you're under existential threat, you want the general to support you and to be there. And so it's very commonplace for generals to go into politics.
I just have to say on this, the comedy of this is that Britain, as you speak there about, Americans ask which college you went to, Britain is so retrograde that here it's what school, as in high school, as Americans would say, even elementary school, prep school, as the ruling class would put it in this country, that you went to. So the background is something that would be nothing to do with you. It would be purely a choice your parents made, nothing about your ability. Maybe that says something about the 3 different countries. In Britain, it's elementary school. In America, it's college. But in Israel, it is absolutely, as you say, it's the military.
Completely. And that is what will give you the ticket to the top, right? By the way, I think that in the United States, for the first time in more than 30 years, the president and the vice president are not Ivy League, which is something to point out. But in Israel, what you have is, what did you do during your military service, right? So Bibi and Gantz, of course, in the elite commando unit, Sayeret Matkal, to say nothing. I'm sorry, Bibi and Bennett, Gantz and Ashkenazi, of course, the IDF chiefs of staff. And Yair Lapid was a reporter for the military magazine B'Machaneh, right? The Israeli version of the Stars and Stripes. So what the subtext against him, well, it's Israel, so the subtext is basically text, right, was always, wait, this guy that has no combat experience, he's going to save us from Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, etc. And that is something that is really ingrained into the society. I think it's changing, right? Because, and we'll talk about Benny Gantz and the devaluation of the idea of the general jumping into politics. But you suddenly realize that politics is a profession. You need to be good at it. It's not a hobby.
I think it's so interesting, this point about the military background and how important it is. Because I remember when Ehud Olmert took over after Ariel Sharon had his stroke, and a lot of commentators at the time were thinking this was itself a turning point because it was partly generational, that the old guard, the sort of founders generation, had given way to this younger generation, but also that it was a kind of technocratic figure, Ehud Olmert. He didn't have this sort of starry military background, and therefore this was perhaps charting the future for Israel, and yet it doesn't sort of seem to work out that way. Here we are, 15 years on, and we're still having the same sort of discussion, and maybe it will be disqualifying for Yair Lapid. I think, the story you mentioned about Benny Gantz, who obviously was a former chief of staff and tried leading this blue and white party, and by the way, came very close, we should say that. I mean, it wasn't like that he was crushed. But I'm wondering if actually the picture is that in Israel, yes, it's necessary to have that kind of background, but it's very much not sufficient. That if you're Benny Gantz, you can run and lose. Ehud Barak was pretty much a failure as a politician.
Yep.
Yes, he made it to prime minister, but kept on losing. And I've watched enough of Israeli elections to remember, the likes of Amram Mitznau, who was seen as a potential savior for Labour.
Oh wow, that's going back in the past.
Going back a long time. But he, because he was a former, I think, a former sort of governor, military commander in the West Bank, and he was, decorated soldier. Israel, perennially, the left particularly reach for these military figures, don't they? And then it kind of doesn't work out. And yet maybe to not have it, as you've been explaining about Yair Lapid, maybe that also is not, doesn't work. So you kind of have to have it, but it's not enough.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that's accurate. And obviously, the left is more prone to that sort of picking the generals, right? Because it wants to be seen as a strong political party. So you see that a lot. It's very commonplace in Israel. You can go through all decades of Israeli history, and you can say Yitzhak Rabin and Moshe Dayan and Ariel Sharon. It goes on and on, right? From the left and from the right. And even when you talk about like in the Israeli discussion of who is the future of Israeli politics, they put out two names. One of them is Aviv Kochavi, the current chief of staff of the IDF. And the other is Yossi Cohen, the head of the Mossad. Again, very security, defense-oriented. This cements a certain worldview that of course, sort of permeates politics, and also it excludes people, right? It excludes women or that are not rising the ranks so quickly in the military, although there is a change in the Israeli military vis-a-vis women in combat, etc. But it excludes women, it excludes minorities. It's a problem. But still, as you say, if you do have that coming from the top brass of the military, you have an edge. Which brings us to Benny Gantz, who decided not to drop out. Now, a lot of people were expecting that. We have to say that he's, remember the film in the 90s, right? Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. So it's Honey, I Shrunk the Party, right? A lot of people expected him to drop out. He's a man who, of course, decided to join Netanyahu, made basically every mistake. It's like a tragedy of errors. And then only to say, you know what, I realized this guy cheated me, and now I'm back in the anti-Bibi camp. And this is where I want to be. He's sort of dangling on the threshold of the electoral threshold. What can we say about him, Jonathan? As you said, he was a great success trying to prevent Netanyahu from forming government for three times until he actually joined him.
Well, I think it does show these limitations of what had been a kind of left impulse, which is to reach for the reassuring general. I mean, it is... I think, we've talked before, just last year was the 25th anniversary of the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, the last non-Bibi figure who is remembered outside Israel, I would say, as a politician, and still kind of embodies the Israel that isn't Bibi. I mean, there are diaspora Jews who the last time they felt really sort of comfortable lining up behind an Israeli prime minister was when it was Yitzhak Rabin. Barak a bit too. But the assumption of both actually was that in order to offer any kind of message of peace, you have to reassure people with the medals on your chest and prove that you have that track record. And what Benny Gantz shows is the limit of that, I think, because he was a former chief of staff. He had all the credentials. He had the medals on the chest, but he didn't really have a vision in his head. And that is what it seems that's what you need. And the fact that he wasn't also an adept politician, so that he couldn't see what, they say in Northern Ireland, what, the dogs in the street knew, that you cannot do business with Netanyahu, that he will trick you and let you down. Everybody knew that, and the sort of kids in Cheder knew that, the dogs in the street knew that, but somehow Benny Gantz didn't know that. And people from the outside, again, we watched that and thought, is he privy to some kind of insight that eludes all the rest of us? Answer, no. He just got chewed up and spat out by Netanyahu. And I'm really fascinated by what you say about whether or not he'll make it across the threshold. I can't really see the reason, if you're an Israeli voter, to vote for him. Because if you are looking for a sort of centrist, reassuring alternative to Bibi, there are options on the right, and if you're looking for an option on the sort of centre left, you've got Yair Lapid and Labour there. So I don't really get what his kind of market niche is, and I don't think he enjoys. Tell me if I'm wrong. Does he enjoy a personal following? I can't imagine much.
Well, I think it's funny. I keep thinking when I think of Benny Gantz that there was a cartoon in the New Yorker a few years ago of two people standing on the roof of a building, and then one person saying to the other, "During my meteoric rise to the top, I failed to notice I was in the wrong building." Yeah, he's not a career politician. You see that. It's pretty clear. As for the reasons to vote for him, what he's saying is, look, I made a mistake. I realize that, but I stood in Netanyahu's government. And by the way, Jonathan, he's the defense secretary and the alternate prime minister until Israel sets up its new coalition that can take months, just to put that in an asterisk there. But he says, I'm the one who stood against any attempt that Netanyahu had made to curtail the judicial system, to delay his trial. All of that, I stood as a wall against it. So that is, I think I should be, that's why I should receive your support. Will it work? I'm not sure. But I am sure that if in 2 or 3 weeks he realizes that he is more a liability than an asset to the center left in Israel, he will drop out. I mean, that I really assume is what might happen.
Really interesting. And you've reminded us before that he has this legal point till November, where unless there's someone else, he becomes the prime minister. And maybe that's why he's staying in, because he thinks to get that, I've got to be in the Knesset. If you want to win the lottery, buy a ticket. And so, he needs to at least be there. Maybe he's clinging to that. Really interesting about the dropping out thing, because I was partly thinking this midnight deadline means these are now the parties. But as you reminded us, people can drop out. We talked last week about Merav Michaeli, this new leader of the Israeli Labour Party. Again, for people outside, the understanding of Israel is there's Netanyahu and then there's always was Labour. I think it's really interesting, this decision that not to merge and not to make a little multiple alliances with all these little parties. I think it's really a brave move by her actually to do this. Partly because I think it it suggests confidence, and I think the polling numbers for her are okay, pretty good. But it's reminding me of just something about PR systems and proportional representation systems. We obviously don't have that here. People always think of them as a really good idea because they accommodate difference. So that, for example, in Britain, if we had a PR system, the Labour Party here would have split into sort of Jeremy Corbyn Labour on the left and the rest of Labour as separate options. But what you really realise watching the Israeli system is it's not just about allowing for ideological difference, it's about allowing for personal difference. And so many of these little parties that sort of have come and gone, like, we were talking about some of them last week who've just not made the threshold, but nor have they merged into Labour. There really was no reason for them except the personalities and ambitions of their leaders. So, Ron Huldai with his party, the Israelis or whatever, what really was the need for that other than his own desire to be a party leader? And if there isn't enough support for that, then in a way, it's quite good that Michaeli isn't saying, I'm going to, indulge you by calling our party a sort of 3-part merger of all these. There's one Labour Party, and if you want to be in it, fine. And if you don't, then don't, rather than indulging this sort of narcissism of small difference. So I sort of admire that from the outside. I don't know if it will work. Would you think it will work for her?
Well, first of all, I mean, Ron Hordei being a failure in national politics proves again that running Tel Aviv and running Israel is Tel Aviv is not Israel, if you needed more proof from that.
Right.
Look, it's a dangerous game. Okay, as you said, it's brave. Let's talk on March 24th and see if it was brave or it was foolish. Because Meretz and Labour Party, especially the Labour of today, after their internal primaries, you have a state-of-the-art microscope. You're not going to find the ideological differences between those two parties. It really is the Judea's People's Front and the People's Front of Judea. Only it's not funny, right? And it's true that if both of them pass the electoral threshold, it's going to be bigger, right? They can bring 9 seats together, and then that's bigger for the whole sort of left-center bloc. But what if one of them doesn't make it? What if Meretz doesn't make it? And then you are basically just putting out the red carpet for the Netanyahu government, because we have to remind our listeners the magic number is 61, right, to rule the Knesset, to form a coalition. So it's a dangerous game. And I think that we will only know if it was brave or foolish in 6.5 weeks.
Right. In my mind was actually these smaller parties that Labour was not merging with. But you're absolutely right. The Meretz thing is much more serious. That sort of progressive left party, and if they are excluded, that will really be a big sort of, if they fall short rather of the threshold. No, my point was really just about this fascinating thing to me about this personality factor, which I don't think it's in the political science textbooks, but I think Israel is the demonstration case that the fragmentation, which you read about always on ideological lines, Israel shows you've got to account for ego and ambition and personality, because PR allows everybody to be the leader, the chief of their own tribe, and that is something that is just not. There's no room for that in a regular parliamentary system. What else is? We talked about the left. What else is?
Right,
how about the right?
On the right side of the political spectrum, you have the extreme right joining hands with the even more extreme right? The Bezalel Smotrich, who used to be Bennett's political partner, merging with Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is the political descendant of Meir Kahane and have been accused of racism and homophobia and xenophobia. And it's really important to say that until Mr. Netanyahu himself stepped in, right, as the person responsible for this shidduch, he did the same thing in the first cycle of the elections in April 2019, Itamar Ben-Gvir was really beyond the political pale in Israel. And Netanyahu made the fact that he was pushing them both together, he made him more legitimate. I have to say that it really is, when you just look at the politics of this, right, and the fact that Netanyahu is like the Beth Harmon of politics, right? He would sit across 10 chessboards and play games against 10 people at the same time. He is that determined to win these elections. Of course, it's also a fight for his political and legal life. But the way in which he, on the one hand, is going to push together the extreme and the extreme right, and on the other hand, pander to the Arab vote, right? It's like the U.S. president saying, you know what, I'm going to talk to Black Lives Matter and I'm going to talk to the KKK in the same week. But that is what he does. He is in it to win. I remember interviewing Ayelet Shaked for The Atlantic 2 years ago, and she said something that kind of resonated. She said, Netanyahu is the most determined person in Israeli politics to be prime minister. And that is the way he is playing the game.
Yeah, I mean, often we say, when a team lose in football, we say, the other side wanted it more. And that, in a way, is often how you do feel that when it comes to politics, Netanyahu just wants it more than the others. He goes that extra mile. I think the this development of the Itamar Ben-Gvir, and his potential entry into first Parliament, but also into a Netanyahu government, it is troubling from the outside. More than troubling, it's really appalling to imagine this far rightist being given that kind of legitimacy. And you mentioned that his ideological mentor is Meir Kahane. I was in Israel the year after Kahane's election and really remember the way he was shunned and ostracized, deemed beyond the pale, so that I think the Israeli media completely ostracized him, just wouldn't put him on the air. And so, he's almost actually like an early precursor of Donald Trump losing his Twitter and Facebook platforms. They effectively silenced him. And, even figures on the right, I think, would shun him, wouldn't want to have anything to do with him. And here, as you say, Netanyahu acting as matchmaker to ensure that he gets into the Knesset and his votes are not wasted by falling short of the threshold, but instead being, adding those far right votes to a potential Israeli coalition. I think it's yet another low, but I don't think it's a coincidence that Kahane was an American. He was an American immigrant to Israel who brought some of those sort of American sensibilities about particularly television into the country. He was, he wasn't on TV much because they kept him off, but I saw him a few times and he was mesmerizing in that way. And so, yeah, it's one thing we've talked about quite a few times, Israel as this sort of oddly trailblazer for trends in politics, science, and other things that then come to the rest of the world. And Kahane maybe was one of them. He was a sort of, charismatic modern populist ahead of the crowd there.
So if we're talking about Israel being a trailblazer, let's leave the scary corridors of Israeli politics and talk about vaccinations. Specifically, I can talk about what's happening here with the vaccination operation, of course, being done very efficiently, but the rest is not working according to plan. But I'm actually very interested, Jonathan, in what is happening in the UK, which actually seems to be very efficient in the vaccination rollout, and what is happening with the EU, those kind of vaccination wars.
Yeah, vaccines are obviously huge news here. There's a huge parallel between Israel and Britain on the whole story because essentially both countries are getting the vaccination rollout right, having got, in Britain anyway, everything else wrong. The numbers are still massively high of infections and hospitalizations, massively high in Britain. But the country has proved itself, having done a very good job on vaccination, some 10 million now vaccinated here. And that's opened up this really strange contrast and confrontation with the EU. I say strange because it's upended, really, the argument about Brexit, where the EU's failure to organise supplies of vaccine has almost become the best argument for Brexit, because the British government of Boris Johnson has been able to say, look, by being on our own, we were nimble and agile, and we could sign our own contracts with the vaccine manufacturers, where the big, clunky, lumbering 27-member EU has took 3 months longer to sign those contracts. And the result is there's just less vaccine available on the continent than there is in Britain. And that forced this confrontation because the EU essentially said to the manufacturers, you haven't got enough for us. Why can't we have some of Britain's supply? Britain obviously said no. And by way of revenge, retaliation, the EU tried to block or limit the supply of the Pfizer vaccine to prevent that getting into the British market. And the back door sort of gateway for that was going to be Northern Ireland, which is governed by different protocols from the rest of the UK. And that was seen as an incendiary move because Northern Ireland, obviously there was a 30-year war in effect there, violence for 30 years. It's to be handled tremendously sensitively. And the European Union, by being reckless with Northern Ireland, lost in a way some of the moral high ground that people who are on the anti-Brexit side of the argument always felt the EU had. So this has been, people talk about vaccine nationalism. This has been a real vaccine international standoff between the European Union and post-Brexit Britain. And unexpectedly, for people like me who are on the Remain side of the argument, anti-Brexit, that it has put the EU in a very negative light and has been a kind of advertisement in the hands of the Brexiteers for what Britain can do when it operates alone. So it's brought together a whole lot of two of the big dominant issues of our time in Britain, coronavirus and Brexit. But for British politics, like Israeli politics, there is still this big question about, if you've mishandled a lot of the pandemic, the fact that you've handled the vaccination well, is that enough for the politicians? Does that mean the public opinion is forgiving of them? And obviously that question still remains to be answered.
I will make a note from the Israeli perspective and the Israeli experience that sadly Israel is discovering that vaccinations are not the quick fix, right? That they should be. That numbers are still very, very high. As I said, Israel reached the mark of 5,000 victims of the coronavirus. And it's going to take time. We are moving swiftly to our Chutzpah and Mensch Awards of the week. Jonathan?
We are. There is just no shortage of candidates for the Chutzpah Prize this week. I mean, probably the front runner has to be Marjorie Taylor Greene. This, should we say eccentric? I mean, maybe that's far too.
I don't know. In British land, you can say eccentric.
That would be
yes.
sort of euphemism. I mean, she is the Republican congresswoman from Georgia who is fully signed up for QAnon, for a whole variety of conspiracy theories. She is a so-called 9/11 truther, which means she does not believe the truth about 9/11, but has constructed conspiracy theories. But it also emerged that in amongst all the things she believes, she holds that the wildfires in California were caused by, and I kid you not, a Jewish space laser.
We have a space laser? You never told me that we have a... Where are you hiding the space laser? Diaspora Jews are hiding the space laser, aren't they?
Well, the elders of Zion gather once a week to decide where they should aim the Jewish space laser. I mean, you have to laugh. I mean, the people have been saying, yeah, that's what I wanted for my bar mitzvah, but it is just deep conspiracy
Wait. I just have to, this point I have to ask, is it an Orthodox space laser? Is it reform? Is it conservative? Does it work on Shabbat? There are a lot of questions in my head about the space laser thing.
You and I know that if there is such a thing as a Jewish space laser, there cannot be only one, right? There will be two. There'll be the one you use and the one you wouldn't.
Exactly. It's like that joke about the synagogue. No, but I mean...
The synagogues on the desert island. I mean, of course there has to be multiple Jewish space lasers. But Marjorie Taylor Greene, for sheer... I mean, Chutzpah is putting it far too gently, the idea that there is such a thing. I mean, she would get... It doesn't fit... That just fits the sort of racist tag rather than the Chutzpah tag. What makes it Chutzpah is that in pleading her case before her fellow Republican Congress people this week, because there was a move and it was successful to strip her of her committee positions, she argued that no, she no longer believes that. And, she moved away from all the QAnon stuff in 2018. At which point, of course, people promptly brought out a whole list of tweets and Facebook posts that she had liked and given the thumbs up to that showed that she was not telling the truth when claiming to have disavowed all this stuff. So I think she gets extra chutzpah points just for the way she's handled the space laser stuff as well as actually believing.
Yeah, I mean, all joking aside, this is worrisome. I mean, first of all, that the claims are just becoming crazier, right? This is like something from a bad LSD flashback, okay? And the first thing. And the second thing, I mean, where's the outrage when someone says something like this? What, you can say this about the Jews and it doesn't matter? I mean, that is, I think, the worrisome current under this extremely, crazy theory. That we
I agree. I think and the fact that, yes, some they had a vote on it, and some Republicans voted. I think 11 voted to strip her of her committee positions, but the overwhelming caucus voted to stand with Marjorie Taylor Greene. I know there's a constitutional argument, or a political argument, a process argument that says this should be up to us, Republicans, what position she has, not Democrats, and it's a bad precedent. I get that, but broadly speaking, and there was another vote as well about Liz Cheney in the House leadership and whether she should be punished for supporting the impeachment of Donald Trump over the attempted insurrection. Overwhelmingly, Republicans are standing with Trump, Marjorie Taylor Greene, the QAnon absorbing base. This is not a good place for one of America's two main political parties. The idea of somebody espousing what is old-fashioned anti-Semitic conspiracy theory and not being excommunicated and banished by her colleagues is troublesome, puts it very mildly, very Englishly, Yonit. I think it's a horribly gloomy moment in American politics, and one which means we need to have brighter thoughts and so we should nominate a mensch.
Okay, so Al Chutzpah, we have an agreement. We're not even going to try to nominate another person, but...
Oh, no shortage of other candidates. We could put
No, but we're in
plenty of other
complete
people in,
agreement.
but
Two
let's
Jews
stick with
actually
her.
agreeing on something is
We
a
agree
good
on
mission
that,
for
yeah.
Shabbat, I think. No, but I would... mensch, you mentioned the Mensch Award, so I want to give the Mensch Award to a menschette, Ruth Dayan, who is an Israeli, not only the widow of Moshe Dayan, the Israeli general turned statesman. I think we mentioned him earlier on this program today, but also an Israeli icon. She died this morning, Friday morning, a month before her 104th birthday. She was born in Haifa, spent her childhood years in England, Jonathan, and after her return to Israel, met Moshe Dayan, fell in love, had two kids. One is Yael, who turned politician like her father, and Asi Dayan, who's an actor and director and one of the great cultural icons of Israeli history, but also Ruth Dayan herself, who set up an Israeli startup, Maskit, which started by bringing the arts and crafts from women who made Aliyah and turned to a trendsetter in Israeli fashion, really an Israeli icon. And in Israel, they tend to compare the Dayan family to the Kennedy family, and she is the mother of that clan, and she passed away today.
Well, that's a very good mensch to honour and to remember. And the Dayan name is one of those storied names that is understood all around the Jewish world. And I remember being on summer camp, age 15, when word came through that Moshe Dayan had died. And, I think there was this sort of moment of pause and silence. It's just one of those names that, storied names that does connect, actually, Israel and diaspora. And but, Ruth Dayan, obviously, as you've explained, a big person in her own right. So she deserves our recognition. My nominee for Mensch of the Week, very, very different. I've never met this man and I don't know much about him, but Moshe Rosenberg. He's announced that he is going to publish soon the superhero Haggadah, a story of signs and marvels. The Haggadah, of course, being the set text that guides us through the Passover Seder, tells the story of the children of Israel and their emergence from slavery in Egypt. I'm one of those people who collects Haggadot. One very proud possession of mine is one from the Marxist Zionist Hashomer Hatzair movement, which instead of saying that God delivered the children of Israel with an outstretched arm, it says the power of workers' liberation took the children of Israel out of slavery.
I'm seeing a bonus episode on Passover.
We'll have to come back to that.
Itself.
When Pesach comes, we'll have to come back to that. I don't have a huge collection of Haggadot, but the superhero Haggadah, a story of signs and marvels, sounds marvelous, literally marvelous. I don't know if it's going to be the literal.
Is it like
comic
Superman,
book heroes.
Spider-Man, etc., saving Bnei Israel, or the Jews themselves are the superheroes? How does that work?
I don't know, and all we've got to go on so far is a graphic, and it's it doesn't have actual Batman or actual Superman on there, so maybe it's going to be superheroes of Moshe Rosenberg's own invention. But he has form on this. He was the author of the unofficial Hogwarts Haggadah, Harry Potter Haggadah. So I just love that. I think any new take on the Haggadah is welcome with me.
I think that's wonderful. I think it's a good place to mention, by the way, that many Jews were behind the stories of the superheroes, right? It's the Schuster Siegel who created Superman and then sold it for $130, right, in the 1930s. Tragic. So they're good on creative, bad on business, but still. And of course, Stan Lee, who is the creative mind behind Marvel Comics and all of that. Spider-Man, X-Men, Hulk. I am such a geek. And also, of course, Wonder Woman, which we have. Right.
Because
She's
of Gal Gadot.
She's Israeli.
I think there is a whole university thesis to be written on the Jewishness of comic book heroes, and the person who's channeled it best is the novelist Michael Chabon with his novel Cavalier and Clay.
Perfect book.
Perfect book. Brilliant writer. The idea of the superhero as a Jewish fantasy in a time of Jewish weakness and powerlessness. In the era of the Holocaust, these young Jewish boys around the world fantasizing that there would be some caped crusader or hero who could rescue them. It's very poignant in the novel, but I think you've mentioned all the key names. It's poignant because it was real. It spoke to something that was there in the very kind of terrified Jewish imagination in the 1930s and 1940s. So Moshe Rosenberg has good lineage. He has good yichus when it comes to imagining Jewish superheroes, and it's a natural fit to put it together with the Haggadah.
We can only agree with that. Jonathan, from the 20 degrees Celsius in sunny Tel Aviv, I am sitting here mocking you with my T-shirt. That's about 68 Fahrenheit for our American listeners.
It is warm where you are and cold and wet here, even if we had a tiny bit of February sunshine. Remember, Unholy is available wherever you get your podcasts. Do subscribe, give us a review, and I'm only going to want a 5-star rating. Why even argue? Let's not haggle about that. Go straight to the 5 stars. But we are available wherever you get your podcasts. Unholy, Talking Jews, Talking News. Yonit, who do we need to thank?
We shall thank Rom Atik, head of podcasts, and Yair Bashan, and Lior Friedman, our editor. And I shall see you next week, Jonathan.
See you then, Yonit.